Nie unijna dotacja, a pożyczka.
Not an EU subsidy, but a multi-billion-pound euro loan, as much as 44 billion euros, for an important purpose, for armaments. But, and here there are several reasons for doubt and questions. Among others, why should the money be spent only within the European Union? The head of government is delighted. After months of waiting and being pushed to the back of the queue for an EU loan, a decision has been made.
Tak? Dzięki.
Listen, we have 44 billion euros for Poland for defence from the EU SAFE programme. The Prime Minister's joy was caused, of course, by the European Commission, which on Monday approved Poland's national plan for the use of defence funds under the SAFE programme. Poland will receive financial support worth nearly 44 billion euros. This is a tsunami of money, and as a minister also responsible for European affairs, I am proud of it. The government promises that nearly 90% of this money will actually go to domestic companies in the defence sector. The largest funds are to be allocated to the Eastern Shield, but this flagship project, which they have been talking about so loudly for 2 years, has 500 million zloty in funding in the 2026 budget. The total cost of the project is 10 billion zloty, 500 million this year and 500 million last year. They will be building the Eastern Shield for 20 years. Because that is only one of the problems with the SAFE programme. The most doubts are raised by the enormous restrictions on the programme. First of all, the money may only be spent within the European Union, and you have to declare what you will be spent on right away. It is no secret that the largest producer of ammunition and a major manufacturer of weapon systems is the German company Rheinmetall. The minister responsible for SAFE says we cannot use this programme to buy American or Korean equipment. In the light of the newly announced National Defence Strategy, not to be confused with the United States National Security Strategy, this puts us in a rather difficult situation. But it is not only the goal that raises doubts, and not even the programme itself, which is supposed to serve Polish security. That is, after all, a priority, but the elimination of American competition. Because much of the military equipment that Poland has already purchased is American. Will it be compatible with what we buy in Europe? We can't have a situation where we have the Polish Army Unit A American and the Polish Army Unit B on European equipment, and the point of contact is a guy with two walkie-talkies, one American, the other German. But that is not all. Starting from the beginning, the very form of payment raises doubts. This is no longer an EU subsidy paid from member states' contributions. It is simply a loan.
Artykuł 5.
Form of financial assistance granted to a member state by the Union. Member states wishing to obtain financial assistance under the SAFE programme should submit an application together with an investment plan for the European defence industry. The Commission and the member states should engage in dialogue to determine the initial loan amounts. This is not financed from the multi-annual framework from membership contributions. It is in the nature of reconstruction funds. It is money borrowed by the European Commission, just like the loan to Ukraine. It will have to be repaid in a moment. It turns out that Germany itself is well aware of this. The press in our western neighbour is already reporting that. Germany will not take advantage of safe loans because it can also borrow on the financial markets on very favourable terms without the support of the European Union. In addition, based on experience, we may suspect that, as in the case of the National Recovery Plan, the European Commission may be able to use any argument to block the disbursement of funds. For example, the rule of law. We keep asking questions, but we don't get any answers. We also ask why we agreed that we would not be able to invest in new arms factories, but would pay for the existing ones. From the United States, we already have, among other things, HIMARS rocket launchers, Patriot surface-to-air missile systems, F-16 and F-35 multi-role aircraft, Black Hawk helicopters from the United States but manufactured in Mielec, which ultimately won over the French Caracals after a controversial tender approved by the previous Tusk government was invalidated. It was unfavourable to Polish industry. The European Union's quiet secret dream is to push, no, not the Russians, the Americans out of Europe. So a huge financial commitment, we will only be able to arm ourselves with EU institutions and companies. And the world's strongest ally, according to Berlin and Brussels, is to remain far away. And all this is very good business for Germany, for France, for the European Union, for Brussels, which will get rich by first lending and then recovering the money as part of the loan, while at the same time having investments in armaments within the European Union. Tusk is fixated on Brussels, Berlin and Paris. Nothing else interests him. But where is Poland's interest in all this?
purges in the Chinese army. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a longtime personal friend of incumbent President Xi Jinping, has been dismissed. Officially, corruption charges have been cited, but in the background there is a struggle for another presidential term and plans to accelerate a possible attack on Taiwan, combating airborne assaults, countering sudden enemy incursions, and testing rapid response procedures. The Taiwanese army is training for a Chinese attack. The threats we face from the enemy today are clearly more serious than they were 10 years ago. We must accelerate the development and preparation of our armed forces. Otherwise, it will be difficult to ensure national security. That is why the authorities in Taipei are closely following the latest reports of purges in the Chinese army. President Xi Jinping's latest political victim is General Zhang Yuxia, the most important general in the Chinese army and a longtime personal friend of the incumbent president. The military officer is suspected of corruption and abuse of power. There have even been accusations of passing information about China's nuclear program to the Americans. But according to experts, this is just a pretext, and the real goal is to prepare the ground for next year's Communist Party Congress, at which new state authorities will be elected, and President Xi has his sights set on another fourth term.
Bear in mind as well that there have been millions of party officials disciplined or arrested or removed since Xi Jinping came to power. In 2025 alone, there were 1 million such cases, and there were 900,000 such cases in 2024. Even a defense minister was removed in 2023. So purges are a very normal part of Chinese Communist Party politics, unfortunately.
But this time in the background, there is not only a struggle for the Chinese communist throne, but also the possibility of an attack on Taiwan, which is a thorn in the side of the authorities in Beijing. The dismissed general was said to have questioned President Xi's plans to achieve operational capability to land on the island by 2027. Paradoxically, the recent dismissals weaken the Chinese army, but only in the short term.
If this is indeed a political power grab by Xi Jinping, and if it means there are fewer constraints on Xi Jinping, in the medium term, I think this increases the likelihood of the use of force against Taiwan.
China is systematically increasing its spending on expanding its military. Official data show that they spend more than $300 billion annually on this purpose, less than the United States, but significantly more than the rest of the world. In the new training year, we will focus on heavy and intensive training, closely linked to operational tasks. We will increase the use of technological means and develop higher skills to be second faster and one move ahead of our opponents. Although the U.S. military is more powerful and experienced, this will certainly not be enough in a confrontation. However, analysts fear the coordination of Beijing and Moscow. A possible attack on Taiwan could divert attention from Russia's neo-imperial policy in Europe. The United States has already recognized China as its main strategic rival and regularly calls on its European allies to strengthen their own armed forces.
Spain is fast-tracking the legal residence of almost all illegal migrants on its territory. The country is introducing regulations according to which anyone who has been there for at least 5 months will be granted legal residence. The government is implementing the decision by means of a so-called royal decree, which means that even parliamentary approval is unnecessary. This is the result of an agreement between two left-wing parties. How far away is Poland from such a solution? Spain, for centuries a bastion of Catholicism in Europe. Today, it is becoming a pioneer in the introduction of left-wing liberal ideologies. Leading the way to decline is Pedro Sanchez, the country's prime minister since 2018 and head of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party. Sanchez is a threat to Europe. The Spanish government is a threat to Europe. The Spanish government's latest initiative is the largest of its kind in more than 2 decades. Legislation has just been approved that will regularize the status of around 500,000 immigrants who have been living in the country illegally until now. The legislation will cover foreigners who have been in Spain for at least 5 months as of the 31st December 2025. Those who have submitted an application before 31st December 2025 may also apply for international protection. The regulations are expected to come into force within a few weeks in the form of royal decree. This makes it possible to bypass a similar bill that has stalled in Parliament. We want to regularise the status of thousands of foreigners in our country as soon as possible. According to government estimates, around 500,000 illegal migrants will benefit from the new regulations, but the number could be much higher. According to a report by the Foncas think tank, in 2025 there were nearly 840,000 people in Spain without regulated status and the necessary documents. Being able to walk down the street peacefully without the risk of being locked up in a detention centre, and being able to work with the rights that all of us who live here deserve. This is a step forward for our country. Although the initiative will help refugees fleeing armed conflict or persecution, it will also give legal residence to hundreds of thousands of people of unknown origin in the country and, consequently, in the European Union, as representatives of conservative Spanish parties in the European Parliament warn. These are people whose origins we do not know, whose criminal past we do not know, and whose intentions for entering Europe we do not know. Once they have obtained a residence permit, they will be able to move freely throughout the European Union. The move by Spain's left-wing government may come as a surprise, but similar regulations, albeit on a much smaller scale, are being introduced throughout Europe. Take Poland, for example. An example is the government's bill to phase out the provisions of the Act on Assistance to Ukrainian citizens, which has been passed by the Sejm and submitted to the Senate for deliberation. The opposition points out the risks that this entails. It cannot lead to a situation where everyone who was in Ukraine before Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is covered by protection. This is because there were many, many Russians in Ukraine at the time, and we may have a situation where this leads to total destabilization. Mr. Kierwiński's bill, some provisions, even word for word, have been transferred from European regulations to national regulations. If we read about social benefits for foreigners, it is a repetition of European regulations from the Migration Pact. So today, under the guise of changing the regulations concerning Ukrainians, these provisions are essentially implementing the Migration Pact. Poland has been temporarily exempted from the mandatory relocation of migrants under the EU's solidarity mechanism, but let's have no doubt that it will be implemented here. It is true that we have heard about the suspension of the quota that may be sent to us, but all the rest of the provisions are being implemented. And what will happen next year? If Poland behaves nicely and agrees to accept and implement regulations that are beneficial to Berlin and Brussels, then perhaps the Migration Pact will be suspended for another year. We can see the results of mass migration in Western European countries such as Spain. In Spain, we have reached historic levels of crime, crimes we have never seen before, gangs and sexual assaults on women and young people on the streets of Spain. We have a very serious housing problem because these hundreds of thousands of migrants do not live on the streets but use public housing and have priority over Spaniards. Millions of people living in our country do not work and live off the public system, while Spaniards pay increasingly higher taxes. Will Poles have to face similar problems to those in Spain? EU migration policy may lead us there.